In the ancient days of Israel, when judges ruled the land, life was often uncertain. It was during this fragile time that a family faced a decision which would forever change their story. The famine that swept across Bethlehem, a place ironically called the house of bread, left families desperate and without hope. Hunger gnawed at their bellies and despair clouded their future. In the midst of this suffering, one man named Elimelech, often shortened to IMC, knew he had to act. Looking at his wife Naomi and their two young sons, Mahlon and Chilion, he made the painful choice to leave everything familiar behind and seek survival in a foreign land. Though the decision weighed heavily on his heart, his love for his family pushed him to take that step of faith. Gathering what little they could carry, the family began their difficult journey eastward. From the hills of Judah, they traveled across the arid landscape, eventually crossing the Dead Sea into the highlands of Moab. The land was strange, its people unfamiliar, and its customs foreign. Most troubling of all, the Moabites served other gods, and their history with Israel was marked by conflict and mistrust. Yet hunger leaves little room for pride or prejudice. IMC's goal was simple: survival. He believed this temporary move would sustain them until the famine in Bethlehem passed. Despite the uncertainty, they pressed forward, clinging to one another as they set foot in the land of Moab. Life in Moab slowly began to take shape. Though they were outsiders, Naomi worked hard to keep her family's traditions alive, teaching her sons about the God of Israel, even as they grew among Moabite neighbors. The boys adapted quickly. They learned the language, made friends, and embraced aspects of their new environment. IMC labored to provide for his household, doing his best to protect and sustain them. For a time, things seemed to stabilize, and perhaps Naomi felt a small measure of peace in knowing her children were safe and growing strong. But then tragedy struck suddenly, shattering the fragile balance they had found. Naomi's world collapsed when Elimelech died. The man who had carried the burden of providing, who had led them into this foreign land, was gone. The weight of grief pressed heavily on Naomi's shoulders, yet she was not left entirely alone. Her sons, now grown into young men, stepped forward to provide and care for their mother. Life had dealt them a cruel blow, but the family pressed on together, determined to survive. Mahlon and Chilion, rooted now in Moabite society, eventually took Moabite wives, Orpah and Ruth. These women, though raised in a different culture with different gods, entered Naomi's household with kindness and respect. Slowly, they became part of the family's daily life, helping with chores and learning from Naomi about the ways of Israel. For a brief moment, joy seemed to return. Naomi found comfort in her sons' marriages, and perhaps she even looked forward to the possibility of grandchildren. The household, though marked by loss, grew again in love and unity. But sorrow was not finished with Naomi's story. After about 10 years, Mahlon and Chilion also died. In the blink of an eye, Naomi had lost her husband and her two sons. What remained was a household of 3 widows, clinging together in shared grief. For Naomi, it felt as if the hand of the Lord himself had turned against her. In a foreign land, with no men to protect or provide, their future seemed uncertain, their days filled with silence, and their nights heavy with mourning. The days following the deaths of Mahlon and Chilion were heavy and uncertain. Naomi, who had once crossed into Moab with hope of survival, now felt utterly emptied. She had buried her husband, and now she had buried both her sons. In her heart, she questioned what was left for her in this foreign land. Every corner of Moab carried memories, some warm but most painful, and each day reminded her of what she had lost. Yet, in the midst of her despair, news reached her ears, a whisper of hope that stirred something deep within her. Word had spread that the famine in Judah was over, and that the Lord had once again blessed his people with abundant harvests. For the first time in years, Naomi saw a reason to lift her eyes toward home. It wasn't an easy decision to make. Returning to Bethlehem meant leaving behind the graves of her husband and sons, leaving behind the land where she had spent nearly a decade. But it also meant stepping back into the community of her youth, among people who knew her before sorrow had carved lines into her face. Naomi began preparing for the journey, gathering what little she and her daughters-in-law still had. She had nothing of value, nothing to offer, except her presence. Yet her heart longed for the comfort of her homeland. She told Ruth and Orpah of her plans, and together, the three women began walking the dusty road back toward Judah. As they traveled, Naomi's mind filled with concern for the younger women by her side. Orpah and Ruth were still young, still with their lives ahead of them. They could remarry, start fresh in Moab, and rebuild what had been taken from them. Naomi, however, felt she had nothing left to give them. Stopping on the road, her eyes brimming with tears, she turned to them and urged them to return to their mothers' homes. With all the love of a grieving mother, she blessed them, praying the Lord would show them kindness as they had shown kindness to her sons and to her. She kissed them goodbye, intending to continue her journey alone, believing it would spare them the hardship of following her into an uncertain future. The three women wept openly at her words. Their bond was deep, woven together by shared grief and mutual love. Orpah and Ruth resisted at first, clinging to Naomi and insisting they would go with her to Israel. But Naomi pressed harder, her voice breaking as she explained the hopelessness of their situation. She had no more sons to give them as husbands. Even if she married again and bore children, it would take years before those boys could grow to be husbands for Orpah and Ruth. The thought was absurd, and Naomi knew it. With painful honesty, she told them it was more bitter for her than for them, for she believed the Lord's hand had turned against her. Faced with Naomi's insistence, Orpah finally gave in. With tears streaming down her face, she kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. It was not a choice made lightly, but it was practical. She returned to her people, her customs, and her gods, hoping to start anew. Ruth, however, remained unmoved. Even as Naomi urged her one last time to follow her sister-in-law back to Moab, Ruth clung to her. There was something unshakable in Ruth's spirit, a determination that went beyond duty or obligation. Her eyes locked with Naomi's, and in that moment she spoke words that would echo through history, words of loyalty, love, and faith that revealed the true depth of her heart. Ruth's words carried a power that silenced Naomi's protests. With steady conviction, she declared her devotion: where Naomi went, she would go; where Naomi stayed, she would stay. Naomi's people would become her people, and Naomi's God would be her God. She even vowed that only death would part them. These weren't the words of someone merely offering comfort, this was a solemn, lifelong covenant. Ruth was willingly choosing an uncertain road, leaving behind the familiarity of Moab, her family, and even her culture, to embrace Naomi's future as her own. Naomi saw the depth of Ruth's resolve and realized there was no point in arguing further. Something in Ruth's eyes spoke of unshakable determination, the kind that could not be swayed by hardship or fear. And so the two women journeyed on together, step after weary step, toward Bethlehem. The path was long and the journey heavy, not just with the weight of their belongings but with the emotions each carried: grief, uncertainty, and, for Ruth, a quiet hope that her commitment would one day bear fruit. When they finally entered Bethlehem, the whole town stirred with curiosity. Whispers spread quickly among the people as they recognized Naomi, the woman who had left so many years ago during the famine. Her return was not what they expected. Gone was the woman who had left with a husband and 2 sons. Now she returned with only a foreign daughter-in-law at her side, her face etched with sorrow. The women of the town asked, "Is this really Naomi?" Her reply revealed the depth of her bitterness. She told them to no longer call her Naomi, which means pleasant, but instead call her Mara, which means bitter, for she believed the Almighty had dealt her life harshly. Though Naomi saw only emptiness, the timing of their arrival held promise. They had come back to Bethlehem just as the barley harvest was beginning. It was a season of new growth, of provision, and though Naomi could not see it yet, God was weaving a story of restoration. Ruth, the foreigner who clung so fiercely to her, was about to play a pivotal role in that story. What appeared to be an ending was, in truth, the quiet beginning of something far greater. As the days passed in Bethlehem, Ruth began to step into her new life with quiet determination. She knew that Naomi had little to provide, and so she decided to take action. Ruth asked her mother-in-law for permission to go into the fields and glean, that is, to gather leftover stalks of grain after the harvesters had gone through. It was a humble, risky task, especially for a foreign woman, but Ruth's heart was set on providing for Naomi. Her courage was not loud or boastful, it was shown through steady, faithful steps of love. By what seemed like chance, but was truly divine guidance, Ruth found herself gleaning in the field of a man named Boaz. He was a wealthy and respected landowner, and unknown to Ruth, he was a relative of Naomi's late husband. When Boaz arrived to oversee the harvest, his eyes quickly noticed Ruth among the workers. Curious about the young woman gathering so diligently, he asked his foreman who she was. He learned that she was the Moabite woman who had returned with Naomi, and that she had been working tirelessly from morning until now with barely a moment's rest. Boaz was deeply moved by Ruth's dedication and kindness toward Naomi. Instead of treating her as an outsider, he approached her with words of reassurance. He told her not to glean in any other field and promised her safety among his workers. More than that, he instructed his harvesters to leave behind extra stalks so Ruth could gather with ease. He even invited her to eat at his table during mealtimes, offering her bread and roasted grain until she was satisfied. For Ruth, who had left everything behind to follow Naomi, this unexpected kindness was both humbling and life-giving. When Ruth returned home to Naomi that evening with an abundance of grain, Naomi's weary heart stirred with hope. She asked where Ruth had worked, and when Ruth spoke the name Boaz, Naomi's face lit up. She recognized him as a close relative, someone who had the right to redeem their family line under the laws of Israel. In that moment, Naomi's bitterness began to soften. She could see God's hand at work, gently piecing together a plan of redemption through Ruth's faithful steps and Boaz's generosity. What had seemed like coincidence was, in truth, divine providence unfolding before their very eyes. Naomi, filled with a renewed sense of hope, began to guide Ruth with wisdom born of her years and her knowledge of Israel's customs. She explained to Ruth that Boaz was not only kind but also a kinsman redeemer. This meant that, according to the law, he had the right to marry Ruth and restore the family line of Elimelech. Naomi encouraged Ruth to take a bold step of faith and present herself to Boaz in a way that showed her desire for his protection and his role as redeemer. It was a plan that carried risk, yet Ruth trusted Naomi's counsel and prepared herself with humility and courage. One evening, after Boaz had finished working and had eaten and drunk, Ruth quietly went to the threshing floor where he was resting. Following Naomi's instructions, she uncovered his feet and lay down there. In the stillness of the night, Boaz awoke and was startled to find a woman at his feet. Ruth's voice, calm yet earnest, spoke of her request. She asked Boaz to spread his garment over her, symbolizing his role as redeemer. Her words were not of desperation, but of faith and trust, that he would act with honor and kindness. Boaz, deeply moved by Ruth's loyalty and virtue, responded with reassurance. He called her a woman of noble character, praising her for not pursuing younger men, whether rich or poor. He promised that he would indeed take up the responsibility of redemption, but also explained that there was another relative closer in line. Still, Boaz assured her that he would see the matter resolved quickly, either by that man or by himself. He sent her home with generous gifts of barley, a sign of his provision and good intent, so that Naomi would know his heart was genuine. When Ruth returned and shared all that had happened, Naomi's spirit swelled with peace. She recognized that the Lord's hand was guiding each detail and told Ruth to wait patiently, for Boaz would not rest until the matter was settled. What had begun as sorrow and emptiness was now blossoming into hope and promise. God was weaving redemption into their story, not only through laws and customs, but through the faithfulness of ordinary people, through Ruth's devotion, Naomi's guidance, and Boaz's integrity. The stage was set for a new chapter, one that would bring restoration beyond anything they had imagined. The next morning, Boaz wasted no time in fulfilling his word. He went straight to the town gate, the place where official matters were settled before the elders of Bethlehem. There, he waited until the nearer kinsman, the one with the first right of redemption, came by. Boaz called him to sit, and he also gathered 10 elders to witness what was about to unfold. With calm authority, Boaz explained the situation. Naomi was selling the land that had belonged to her late husband, Elimelech. As the closest relative, this man had the right to redeem it first. At first, the man was willing, seeing an opportunity to expand his property. But Boaz then explained the full weight of the responsibility, that redeeming the land also meant taking Ruth, the Moabite widow, as his wife in order to carry on Elimelech's family line. At this, the man hesitated. He realized that accepting this duty could endanger his own inheritance. Reluctantly but honestly, he declined the offer, saying he could not redeem it for himself. And so, in the presence of the elders, he formally transferred the right of redemption to Boaz by removing his sandal, according to the custom of the time. The people gathered at the gate witnessed the act with great joy. The elders blessed Boaz, praying that the Lord would make Ruth like Rachel and Leah, the mothers who built the house of Israel, and that their family would be renowned in Bethlehem. It was a sacred moment, not only legally binding but also divinely appointed. Ruth, the foreign woman who had once seemed to carry only sorrow, was now welcomed into Israel's story with honor and blessing. Boaz's integrity and Ruth's faithfulness had come together in a union that was far more than coincidence, it was providence. God was showing his people that redemption was not limited by nationality, status, or circumstance. Through their obedience and courage, a broken family line was being restored, and what once seemed bitter and empty was now overflowing with blessing. The Lord was writing a story that stretched beyond Naomi and Ruth, one that would ripple through generations to come. Boaz and Ruth were soon united in marriage, a union not only blessed by the people but also richly blessed by God himself. Their home, once built on grief and uncertainty, became a place of joy and restoration. For Naomi, who had returned to Bethlehem empty and bitter, this marriage was nothing short of a miracle. She witnessed the kindness of God in a way she could not have imagined. The woman who had once said the Almighty had dealt her bitterly now held in her heart the sweetness of renewed hope. In time, the Lord granted Ruth and Boaz a son. The women of Bethlehem rejoiced with Naomi, declaring that the Lord had not left her without a redeemer. They praised God for his faithfulness, saying this child would renew her life and sustain her in her old age. Ruth, who had once been a foreigner with no claim to Israel's promises, was now honored as better than 7 sons because of her unwavering love and devotion. Her faith and courage had rewritten not only Naomi's story but her own as well. Naomi, once emptied of all, now found her arms full. She took the baby into her embrace and cared for him as if he were her own. The child was named Obed, and he grew to become the father of Jesse, the grandfather of David, the great king of Israel. From Ruth's faithfulness and Boaz's integrity came a lineage that would one day lead to the Messiah himself. What began with famine, loss, and despair was transformed into a legacy of hope and redemption that would bless the entire world. Through Ruth's story, God revealed that his plans are never limited by circumstance or by human expectation. He works through the unlikely, the humble, and the faithful to accomplish purposes far greater than anyone can see in the moment. Ruth's loyalty, Boaz's righteousness, and Naomi's restored hope all became threads in the divine tapestry leading to the promise of salvation. It was a story of redemption that began in sorrow but ended in eternal glory, reminding us that no life is too broken for God to restore. The birth of Obed marked not just the continuation of a family line, but the unfolding of God's grand design. The people of Bethlehem celebrated this child as a gift of redemption, a living reminder that God turns mourning into joy and loss into abundance. Obed's presence brought laughter back into Naomi's home, filling the quiet spaces once occupied by grief with the sound of new life. For Ruth, who had once left everything behind in Moab, this child was both a reward for her faith and a sign that her story had found its place within God's eternal plan. As Obed grew, so too did the recognition of God's hand upon this family. The elders' blessing over Ruth and Boaz began to take shape, for their household became a testimony of God's mercy and covenant love. The union of an Israelite man and a Moabite woman showed that God's grace extended beyond boundaries of nation or tradition. Through their son, a new chapter opened for Israel, one that would lay the foundation for future generations of leaders, warriors, and kings. The genealogy that followed Obed was no accident. He fathered Jesse, and Jesse would father David, who rose from shepherd boy to king, a man after God's own heart. From David's line would come the Savior, Jesus Christ, whose redemption would extend not only to Israel but to the entire world. Thus, Ruth's choice to cling to Naomi and to the God of Israel became a turning point in history. Her story was no longer just about survival, it was about divine destiny. The story of Ruth reminds us that every act of faith, no matter how small it may seem, can echo into eternity. Ruth's loyalty on a dusty road, her humility in the fields, her courage on the threshing floor, all became part of a plan far greater than she could ever imagine. God used her steadfast love and Boaz's integrity to bring forth a lineage of kings, prophets, and ultimately, the Redeemer himself. Through this, we are reminded that God is always at work, turning ashes into beauty, bitterness into blessing, and ordinary lives into vessels of eternal purpose. The final chapter of this portion of Ruth's story brings the full circle of God's providence into focus. Naomi, once bitter and bereft, now experienced the sweetness of restoration through the faithful actions of Ruth and the integrity of Boaz. The town of Bethlehem witnessed how God's hand could transform sorrow into joy, loss into abundance, and hopelessness into legacy. Naomi's household, once marked by famine and death, had become a beacon of God's faithfulness, a living testament to the power of loyalty, courage, and divine timing. Ruth, whose journey began in a foreign land with nothing but faith in her heart, became an honored matriarch in Israel. Her story reminded everyone that God's plans often work through the humble, the overlooked, and the seemingly insignificant. The choice to leave her homeland, to follow Naomi, and to work diligently in the fields were not just acts of human devotion, they were instruments of God's larger design. In her hands, the threads of redemption, lineage, and covenant promise were woven together, creating a tapestry of hope that would extend far beyond her own life. Boaz's role also illustrates the importance of integrity, compassion, and responsibility. By honoring the law and acting justly as a kinsman redeemer, he not only secured Ruth and Naomi's future but also became part of God's redemptive plan for Israel. His actions demonstrate that obedience to God's principles and a heart inclined toward righteousness can bring about blessings that ripple through generations. Through Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi, God's faithfulness is made tangible, showing that he rewards loyalty, honors courage, and restores those who trust in him. The story of Ruth concludes this section by pointing toward a legacy that would shape history. Obed, born to Ruth and Boaz, would father Jesse, and Jesse would father David, the greatest king of Israel. Through David's line, the promise of the Messiah would be fulfilled, bringing redemption to all who believe. What started as famine, loss, and foreignness had now become a foundation for God's ultimate plan of salvation. Ruth's faithfulness, Naomi's perseverance, and Boaz's righteousness together created a chain of events that would echo throughout generations, demonstrating that God works through ordinary people in extraordinary ways. Finally, Ruth's story is a timeless reminder that God's providence is often hidden in the smallest acts of loyalty and love. From gleaning in the fields to speaking words of steadfast commitment, every choice can have eternal significance. Even in moments of uncertainty and fear, when life seems bitter and empty, God's hand is at work. Through Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz, we see that redemption is possible, that loyalty and faith are powerful, and that God's plan, though sometimes mysterious, is always perfect. Their story invites every reader to trust in divine timing, embrace courage, and walk faithfully, knowing that even the most humble actions can change the course of history. Boaz and Ruth's marriage marked the fulfillment of God's providential plan, transforming what began as hardship and uncertainty into a story of hope, redemption, and legacy. Ruth, the foreign widow who had faithfully accompanied Naomi, was now honored as a wife, fully integrated into Israelite society, and recognized for her virtue, loyalty, and courage. Boaz's steadfastness, integrity, and adherence to the law ensured that everything was done with honor, protecting Ruth's dignity and safeguarding the family lineage. Their union was more than personal, it was a divine orchestration, linking the past, present, and future through faithful obedience and providential timing. The marriage brought not only emotional and social security but also practical provision. Ruth and Naomi, who had faced uncertainty and poverty, now experienced stability and abundance. The story emphasizes how acts of kindness, loyalty, and righteousness can ripple outward, bringing blessings to others and aligning with God's greater plan. Ruth's faith and humility, combined with Boaz's generosity and integrity, set an example of how God works through ordinary people to achieve extraordinary outcomes. Through this marriage, the lineage of redemption continued. Ruth and Boaz became the grandparents of King David, establishing a line that would ultimately lead to the Messiah. This connection highlights how God's plans often unfold quietly, through the faithful and the righteous, even in the most unexpected places. Ruth's journey from Moab to Bethlehem, from widowhood to becoming part of God's covenantal story, illustrates that God sees and rewards faithfulness, loyalty, and courage. The community's role in witnessing and affirming the marriage further underscores the importance of accountability, transparency, and shared blessing. By conducting the transaction at the city gate and involving the elders, the process ensured legitimacy and honor for all parties. The elders' blessing and public acknowledgement reinforced that Ruth was now a respected member of Israel, and Boaz's actions preserved both legal and moral propriety. This communal validation demonstrates how God's plan often intersects with social structures to ensure order, fairness, and recognition. Finally, the story of Boaz and Ruth concludes this chapter with a timeless lesson on divine providence, courage, and integrity. God's guidance, seen in Ruth's faithful choices, Naomi's wisdom, and Boaz's righteousness, created a legacy that would echo through generations. It reminds us that even in moments of vulnerability and uncertainty, God's hand can orchestrate events for ultimate good. Through loyalty, courage, and kindness, ordinary actions can become extraordinary instruments of divine purpose, shaping history and leaving a lasting impact for generations to come. After the joyous union of Boaz and Ruth, life settled into a rhythm of blessing, provision, and promise. Ruth's transformation from a vulnerable widow to a respected wife and matriarch illustrates the remarkable ways God rewards faithfulness and courage. Her devotion to Naomi and her willingness to leave everything familiar behind had not only preserved her own life but had also secured a future for her mother-in-law. Together, Ruth and Naomi could now face life with confidence, knowing that God's plan had provided protection, sustenance, and honor. The harvest of barley that once symbolized temporary provision now became a memory of divine favor, pointing toward lasting security. Boaz's role as a kinsman redeemer extended beyond legal obligation. It was an expression of God's justice, mercy, and love. He had carefully followed the law, respected Ruth's dignity, and provided abundantly without humiliating her. In doing so, Boaz modeled righteousness that was both ethical and compassionate. His actions reveal how God works through people who act with integrity, transforming ordinary transactions into vessels of divine blessing. The legal formalities at the city gate were not mere procedure, they were instruments through which God's will was enacted, ensuring that Ruth's place in Israelite society was legitimate and recognized by the community. The story also emphasizes the importance of courage and initiative in pursuing God's plan. Naomi's wisdom and Ruth's obedience demonstrate how faith and discernment can lead to extraordinary outcomes. Ruth's willingness to follow Naomi's guidance at the threshing floor, despite the risk of misunderstanding, shows that bold, faithful actions often precede great blessings. Meanwhile, Boaz's attentive care and integrity in handling the other kinsman redeemer illustrate how vigilance, honor, and patience can bring God's plan to fruition. Each participant in this story exemplifies a role that, when faithfully executed, aligns with divine purpose. Finally, the marriage of Boaz and Ruth is a vivid reminder that God's providence often works quietly but powerfully through everyday acts. Loyalty, humility, courage, and generosity, qualities displayed by Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz, become conduits of God's blessing. Through these ordinary people, God wove a story that not only impacted their immediate lives but also shaped the course of Israel's history. Ruth's journey from Moab to Bethlehem, from widowhood to marriage and ultimately into the lineage of David and the Messiah, underscores the transformative power of faithfulness. It teaches that God honors steadfast hearts, and even in the face of uncertainty, divine providence can turn trials into triumphs. This chapter closes with a powerful lesson: acts of kindness, courage, and integrity, when guided by faith, can become instruments of divine legacy. Ruth and Boaz's story is more than historical record, it is an enduring example of how ordinary human decisions, made with humility and faith, can intersect with God's extraordinary plan. Their lives remind us that no act of loyalty or generosity is wasted, and that God's providence works through the faithful to create blessings that extend far beyond what the eye can see. Following the establishment of their marriage, Ruth and Boaz experienced not only personal joy but also the tangible blessings of God in their household. Life became a testimony to the faithfulness of the Lord, as the couple enjoyed both prosperity and favor among their community. Ruth, once a foreign widow with nothing but loyalty and courage, now had a home filled with security, dignity, and purpose. Boaz, steadfast in integrity and kindness, demonstrated how God can work through human hearts to provide protection, abundance, and honor. Their story illustrates that when faith and obedience align with divine guidance, blessings are both immediate and long-lasting. Ruth's integration into the Israelite community was profound. No longer just a Moabite widow, she became a respected member of Bethlehem, her character recognized and celebrated. The elders and townspeople, witnesses to her journey, praised her loyalty and virtue, acknowledging that her presence among them brought honor and hope. Through her actions, Ruth showed that courage, humility, and steadfast faith could transcend cultural boundaries, fostering acceptance and blessing. Her transformation underscores the power of God's providence to elevate the faithful, demonstrating that He honors hearts that choose righteousness over comfort or familiarity. The union of Ruth and Boaz also highlights God's careful orchestration of legacy and lineage. Through their marriage, Ruth became part of a sacred genealogy that would ultimately lead to King David and, generations later, the Messiah. Every act, Ruth's devotion to Naomi, her boldness at the threshing floor, and Boaz's adherence to law and mercy, was part of a larger plan that ensured God's promises unfolded in history. Their story teaches that God's timing is perfect, that patience and faith yield results far beyond immediate understanding, and that even small acts of loyalty and courage can have eternal significance. Finally, the household of Boaz and Ruth became a living symbol of God's redemption and providence. Through their lives, God demonstrated that kindness, integrity, and faithfulness are never in vain. The story encourages us to trust in divine guidance, to act with courage and humility, and to recognize that God often works in ways unseen until the fullness of blessing is revealed. Ruth's journey from hardship to honor, from loss to a thriving family, serves as an enduring reminder that faith, when combined with righteous action and trust in God, can turn every challenge into a testimony of divine grace. After Ruth and Boaz were united, the blessings of God continued to manifest in their lives, extending beyond their personal happiness to the well-being of their household. Their home became a place of provision, security, and joy, a sanctuary where loyalty, integrity, and faith were rewarded. Ruth, who had once faced uncertainty and hardship as a foreign widow, now thrived under Boaz's protection and care. Each day reflected God's providential hand, showing that perseverance, obedience, and trust in Him yield abundant fruit. Ruth's integration into the Israelite community became increasingly visible. The townspeople observed her dedication, humility, and virtuous character, acknowledging her as a woman of honor and strength. She was no longer seen merely as an outsider, but as a vital and respected member of the community. Her story became an example of how steadfast faith and righteous actions can break barriers, inspire trust, and attract divine favor. Ruth's courage and loyalty demonstrated that God's purposes often work through those willing to step forward in faith, even when the path is uncertain. The marriage of Boaz and Ruth also had profound implications for God's larger plan. Through their union, Ruth became part of a lineage that would eventually lead to King David, and ultimately, the Messiah. Every choice they made, the care Ruth showed Naomi, her boldness at the threshing floor, and Boaz's adherence to justice and generosity, was woven into God's sovereign plan for redemption. Their lives illustrate that acts of loyalty, courage, and integrity, though seemingly small, can ripple through generations, shaping history according to God's divine purposes. Ultimately, the household of Boaz and Ruth became a living testimony of God's faithfulness. Their story shows that when faith aligns with righteous action and divine timing, obstacles are overcome, and blessings are multiplied. Ruth's journey from a life of uncertainty to one of honor and abundance demonstrates the power of God's providence to transform lives. Theirs is a story of hope, redemption, and divine orchestration, a timeless reminder that God's promises are fulfilled for those who trust and act faithfully. As the seasons passed, Ruth and Boaz's household became a beacon of hope and stability, not just for themselves but for Naomi as well. Naomi, who had once faced bitter loss and despair, now experienced the sweetness of restoration through the faithfulness of Ruth and the integrity of Boaz. Every meal shared, every harvest gathered, and every act of kindness was a visible sign of God's hand working in their lives. Their home was no longer a place of uncertainty, but a sanctuary of provision and peace, showing that obedience and trust in God's guidance bring lasting security. The community around them recognized the extraordinary nature of their union. Ruth, the foreign widow, had earned respect and admiration through her humility, diligence, and loyalty. Boaz, in turn, was honored for his generosity, righteousness, and adherence to the law, showing that true leadership is exercised through integrity and care for others. Together, they exemplified a model of godly living, demonstrating how faith, courage, and moral character can inspire a community and transform lives. Their home became a place where values were lived, lessons were taught, and hope was renewed. Importantly, the legacy of Ruth and Boaz reached far beyond their immediate household. Their union played a critical role in God's redemptive plan for Israel. Through them came Obed, the father of Jesse, and the grandfather of King David. This lineage, chosen and blessed by God, shows how acts of loyalty, faith, and righteousness can influence generations and align with divine purposes. What began with a simple act of gleaning in a field eventually became part of a sacred story of providence, illustrating that God's timing and design often unfold in ways that surpass human understanding. The story of Ruth and Boaz stands as a timeless testament to the power of faith, courage, and God's providence. It reminds us that even in moments of uncertainty or hardship, steadfast loyalty, integrity, and trust in God can transform lives and secure blessings beyond imagination. Their journey, from loss and despair to hope, honor, and divine purpose, serves as an enduring example that God's promises are reliable, and His plans, though mysterious at times, are always perfect. In every detail of their lives, we see how divine orchestration works through faithful hearts willing to act with courage and righteousness. Ruth and Boaz's story continued to unfold as a testament to faith, loyalty, and God's providence. With their union established, Ruth settled into a life of security and belonging, no longer a foreign widow wandering in uncertainty. Each day brought the rhythm of work, prayer, and devotion, now interwoven with the joy of family and community. Their home became a place of peace, where the past hardships of loss and displacement were gradually replaced by hope and abundance, showing the transformative power of God's providential care. Naomi, who had once been bitter and desolate, now experienced the fullness of joy and restoration. She witnessed firsthand how God's plans, though often hidden and mysterious, could turn sorrow into blessing. Through Ruth's loyalty and Boaz's integrity, Naomi's household was renewed, demonstrating that faithfulness and obedience are rewarded in tangible ways. Her life became a living testimony of how God honors those who trust Him, providing both daily provision and long-term stability. The birth of Obed further cemented the significance of this union. Obed, the son of Ruth and Boaz, was more than a child, he was a living symbol of redemption and continuity. His presence affirmed God's hand at work, weaving together the threads of human courage, loyalty, and divine purpose into a lineage that would shape the future of Israel. Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz saw in Obed a tangible reminder that God's promises never fail, and that acts of faithfulness can ripple across generations, leaving a lasting impact far beyond what anyone might imagine. Through Ruth and Boaz, we also see the broader implications of God's providence. Their story is a reminder that no act of kindness, integrity, or courage goes unnoticed in God's sight. Every decision, every small step of faith, and every gesture of loyalty contributes to the unfolding of His greater plan. The story encourages believers to act righteously, trust God's timing, and remain steadfast in faith, knowing that their lives, no matter how humble or ordinary they may seem, can play a role in God's extraordinary design for the world. With the birth of Obed, the household of Naomi and Ruth was transformed into a beacon of hope and renewed purpose. Obed was more than a son, he was a living testimony to God's faithfulness and the fulfillment of promises that had seemed distant and uncertain. Every cry and coo of the child echoed with the assurance that loyalty, courage, and trust in God's guidance could produce blessings beyond human expectation. Ruth's journey from a foreign widow to a mother of a significant lineage highlighted how obedience and faith could intersect with divine timing to create extraordinary outcomes. Boaz, through his steadfast character and adherence to God's law, exemplified integrity and protection. His actions were not driven by mere duty or social expectation, but by a deep understanding of justice, honor, and divine responsibility. By redeeming Ruth and the family property, he preserved not only family inheritance but also the sanctity of lineage and faith. Boaz's life illustrated how acting righteously, even when inconvenient, aligns with God's greater design, demonstrating that moral courage often carries long-lasting and far-reaching consequences. Ruth, too, became a model of loyalty and courage. Leaving her homeland, choosing faith over familiarity, and committing herself to Naomi and God's people were acts of profound bravery and trust. Her life shows that true faith is active, demonstrated not just in words or belief but through tangible actions that honor God and others. Ruth's journey, though filled with uncertainty and risk, ultimately positioned her as an integral link in the line that would lead to King David and, later, the Messiah, revealing how God uses ordinary people to fulfill extraordinary purposes. Through the unfolding of these events, the community of Bethlehem witnessed firsthand the power of divine providence. From Boaz's initial kindness in the fields to the public redemption at the town gate, the story was not merely private, it was a communal testament to God's justice, mercy, and providential care. The elders and townspeople celebrated and blessed the union, affirming that acts of faithfulness, loyalty, and integrity are visible to God and honored in human society. Ruth and Boaz's story thus became a timeless illustration that God orchestrates life's circumstances to bring about redemption, blessing, and continuity, even from the most humble beginnings. As Obed grew, the joy he brought to Naomi and Ruth extended far beyond their household. Each day with him reminded them of God's faithfulness and the extraordinary outcome of their trust and perseverance. Obed was not only a blessing to them but also a bridge to the future, a living promise that the lineage of faithful and courageous individuals would continue. His presence was a constant reminder that loyalty, humility, and obedience are never overlooked by God, even in moments of hardship and uncertainty. The elders and neighbors of Bethlehem marveled at the transformation in Naomi's household. Where there had once been mourning and scarcity, there was now life, abundance, and hope. Obed's birth underscored the principle that God often works quietly behind the scenes, turning acts of kindness, integrity, and devotion into lasting blessings. The community's recognition and celebration of Obed symbolized a shared understanding that divine providence is intertwined with human actions guided by faith. Naomi's role as a grandmother became a testament to endurance and vision. She had witnessed her family's near destruction and had navigated uncertainty with wisdom and discernment. Now, seeing Obed in her arms, she understood that every decision she had made, every counsel she had given to Ruth, had aligned with God's plan. Her joy was not merely personal but deeply spiritual, for through Obed, God's promises were visibly unfolding, reaffirming her belief that God's timing and guidance are perfect. Ruth, too, embraced her new role with humility and reverence. From a foreign widow to the mother of a child destined for a significant legacy, she recognized the depth of God's mercy and provision. Her journey illustrated how faith, courage, and loyalty could transform personal struggle into generational impact. Through Obed, Ruth's devotion and obedience were rewarded, and her life became a powerful example of how ordinary individuals, when guided by God, can participate in the extraordinary unfolding of His divine plan. Obed's growth was marked by an environment filled with love, guidance, and a deep sense of purpose. Naomi and Ruth nurtured him with care, instilling values of faith, integrity, and respect for God's ways. Each milestone in his early life was celebrated not just as a personal achievement but as a testament to the providence that had guided his family through trials and uncertainty. Obed became a living reminder that God's blessings often arrive through patience, faith, and unwavering commitment to righteousness. As he began to interact with the broader community, Obed's presence drew attention and admiration. Neighbors and elders observed the boy with pride, seeing in him the fruit of divine favor and human diligence. His family's story had already inspired many, and now Obed became a symbol of hope and continuity. Through his simple acts, laughter, and obedience, he demonstrated that faithfulness to God and to one another could leave a lasting impression on the world around them. The story of Obed also highlighted the power of intergenerational blessing. Naomi, who had once felt bereft and hopeless, now saw her family line strengthened through Ruth's dedication and her own wise guidance. The past struggles, the losses, and the uncertainty were all transformed into a legacy of faith and provision. Obed embodied the fulfillment of God's promise to sustain those who remain faithful, demonstrating that divine intervention can reshape lives and communities in profound ways. Through every step of Obed's early life, it became clear that his existence was more than a personal blessing, it was part of a greater narrative that would impact generations to come. The devotion of Ruth, the wisdom of Naomi, and the providence of God converged to create a foundation for a future that held not just survival, but significance. Obed's life reminded everyone that when human actions align with divine purpose, the outcomes can ripple far beyond what one might imagine, leaving a legacy of hope, faith, and enduring blessing. The life of Obed became a bridge between past trials and future promise, a living testament to the faithfulness of God and the resilience of those who trust Him. Every day, his presence reminded Naomi and Ruth of the journey they had undertaken, from loss, uncertainty, and exile, to provision, hope, and restoration. Obed was more than a child, he was a symbol that God's timing is perfect and that the faithful will witness the fruition of His plans, even when circumstances seem bleak. As Obed grew, his character began to shine, reflecting the virtues modeled by Ruth and Naomi. Kindness, humility, and devotion were evident in his actions, showing that a life nurtured under love and divine guidance produces not just survival, but moral and spiritual strength. The community recognized in him a continuation of God's blessing, and his presence became a source of inspiration for neighbors and family alike. His life illustrated that true prosperity is measured not only in material terms but also in the richness of character and integrity. Obed's story also emphasized the importance of legacy and generational blessing. Ruth, a foreigner who had embraced a new faith and family, and Naomi, who had experienced the pain of loss, now witnessed the profound impact of their faithfulness. Obed became the tangible outcome of their devotion and courage, proving that God honors the steadfast and rewards those who act with righteousness and love. Their trials were not in vain. Through Obed, hope and continuity were secured, connecting the past to the promise of the future. Finally, Obed's existence served as a reminder that divine providence often works quietly through human decisions. Ruth's courage, Naomi's wisdom, and Boaz's integrity all intersected to fulfill God's plan. Obed was the living fruit of this divine orchestration, showing that even in the midst of ordinary circumstances, fields, threshing floors, and family homes, God's hand is at work. His life carried the message that faith, courage, and integrity, when combined with God's guidance, can create a legacy that endures far beyond one lifetime. Boaz and Ruth's marriage took place openly, with the full recognition and approval of the community, following the proper legal procedures at the city gate. This wasn't a secret union or an impulsive decision, it was a carefully honored arrangement that reflected both societal norms and divine guidance. Boaz, a prosperous and respected man of Bethlehem, and Ruth, a loyal Moabitite widow who had shown extraordinary devotion to Naomi, were now joined in a bond that was both socially significant and spiritually meaningful. Their union, though unexpected, marked the beginning of a story that would ripple through generations and shape the history of Israel. The Lord's blessing was evident immediately. Ruth, who had remained childless for years after her first husband's death, now conceived a son. This was more than a personal blessing, it was a sign of God's favor resting upon the family. The women of the town gathered to celebrate, not just Ruth's joy, but Naomi's restoration. They praised God, saying, "This day the Lord has not left you without a guardian redeemer." They recognized that Ruth's loyalty and love had brought Naomi a blessing far greater than many sons could have provided. This communal celebration highlighted the deep cultural and spiritual significance of the birth. Naomi's joy was palpable as she took the newborn child into her arms. The gesture was symbolic, affirming that Obed would carry on the lineage of Naomi's late son, maintaining continuity in a society where inheritance and family lines were crucial. The women of Bethlehem exclaimed, "Naomi has a son." A communal acknowledgement of God's providence and the restoration of hope. This child, Obed, would eventually become the grandfather of King David, showing that God's plans often unfold through ordinary events and faithful acts of love. This section of the story reminds us that God's blessings often arrive in unexpected ways. Ruth, a foreign widow with no social standing, became an essential part of Israel's history through her loyalty, courage, and faithfulness. Boaz, through integrity and righteousness, became the instrument of God's redemption. Together, they demonstrate how ordinary lives, aligned with God's will, can be transformed into extraordinary legacies that echo across generations. The birth of Obed is not just a family milestone, it's a powerful reminder that God turns loss into restoration, despair into joy, and ordinary circumstances into instruments of His divine plan. Ruth and Boaz's story encourages us to trust God's timing, embrace acts of faithfulness, and recognize that even small, faithful decisions can have eternal significance. Their union, blessed by God and celebrated by the community, marks the beginning of a chain of events that will ultimately lead to the lineage of King David and the Messiah. The story of Ruth and Boaz does not end with the birth of Obed, it blossoms into a profound testament of God's providence and the importance of faithfulness. Even though Ruth was a foreigner from Moab, historically excluded from Israel's assembly, her unwavering loyalty to Naomi and commitment to the God of Israel paved the way for her inclusion in the community. Her actions demonstrated that true devotion transcends ethnic boundaries and societal prejudices. The people of Bethlehem witnessed not just a marriage or a birth, but the fulfillment of God's plan through a seemingly ordinary woman, whose faithfulness had eternal consequences. Ruth's inclusion in Israel's lineage was remarkable, considering the Mosaic law's strict prohibitions against Moabites entering the assembly of the Lord. Yet, here she was, not only accepted but honored as the great-grandmother of King David. This highlights a central theme of the story: God often works through the marginalized and unlikely. The weak, the lowly, and the unexpected are frequently chosen to fulfill divine purposes. Ruth, a widow with no status, had become an essential link in the chain that would lead to the Messiah, demonstrating that God's ways often defy human expectations. The story also draws a parallel between Boaz's role as kinsman redeemer and the ultimate redemption offered through Jesus Christ. Just as Boaz paid a price to redeem Naomi's family and marry Ruth, Jesus paid the ultimate price to redeem humanity from sin. Boaz, a relative and guardian, acted out of love, responsibility, and justice, reflecting the character of Christ, who redeems not just a family line, but all who believe in Him. Ruth's story foreshadows this ultimate act of redemption, teaching that God's provision often comes through faithful human actions that align with His divine plan. Divine providence is evident throughout Ruth's journey. The seemingly coincidental events, the timing of her arrival in Bethlehem, the choice to glean in Boaz's field, the encounter at the threshing floor, and the other redeemer stepping aside, were all guided by God's invisible hand. These moments remind us that God orchestrates life in ways we cannot always see. Every small act of faith, every choice to honor God and others, contributes to a larger plan. Ruth's life illustrates that ordinary decisions, like choosing loyalty and righteousness, can set the stage for extraordinary outcomes in God's kingdom. Ruth's story continues to reveal the profound impact of faithfulness and courage in ordinary life. Her simple declaration, "Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God," was more than words of loyalty, it was a life-changing decision that aligned her with God's plan. She could not have known that this choice would place her in the lineage of the Messiah, yet her steadfastness created ripples of blessing that extended far beyond her own circumstances. Every act of devotion, no matter how small, carries eternal significance when it honors God and serves others with integrity. The birth of Obed, Ruth and Boaz's son, is not only a personal blessing but a community celebration. Naomi's joy, the congratulations from the women of Bethlehem, and the naming of the child all emphasize the communal nature of God's blessings. The child symbolized restoration and hope for Naomi's family, demonstrating how God's provision often extends beyond the individual to impact an entire community. Ruth, the outsider, had become an instrument of divine blessing, showing that God's grace is inclusive and far-reaching. This story also underscores the enduring power of God's covenant and promises. Just as he promised Abraham that all nations would be blessed through him, Ruth's faithfulness became part of this unfolding covenant. Through her inclusion in Israel's lineage and eventually in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the story illustrates that God's plan transcends borders, ethnicity, and human expectation. Ruth's commitment to God and Naomi positioned her at the center of a divine narrative, showing that faithfulness in small, daily choices can lead to extraordinary outcomes. Ruth's journey also teaches about perseverance and trusting God amidst uncertainty. From a foreign widow gleaning in the fields to an honored ancestor of Israel's greatest king, every step in her story was marked by risk, humility, and unwavering trust. Her courage to step into unknown territory, guided by faith and obedience, exemplifies how God uses ordinary people in extraordinary ways. The story encourages believers to trust that their choices, acts of loyalty, and moments of courage are not wasted, but woven into God's larger plan for redemption and blessing. As Ruth and Boaz's story unfolds, we see the incredible role of divine providence guiding every detail. What seemed like a series of coincidences, Ruth choosing Boaz's field, arriving at the start of the harvest, meeting Boaz at just the right moment, was, in reality, God's hand orchestrating events for a greater purpose. These moments remind us that nothing in our lives is truly random. Even the smallest decisions, like choosing a place to work or extending kindness to others, can become part of God's greater plan when made with faith and integrity. Boaz's actions as a kinsman redeemer beautifully foreshadow the ultimate redemption brought through Jesus Christ. Just as Boaz paid the price to redeem the inheritance and secure Ruth's future, Christ paid the ultimate price to redeem humanity. Boaz's integrity, generosity, and obedience to the law reflect the character of a redeemer who acts with care, protection, and honor. Similarly, Jesus' sacrifice shows that God's redemption is not only personal but also relational, restoring broken lives and extending hope to those who are marginalized or overlooked. The story of Ruth also teaches the profound impact of loyalty and small acts of faithfulness. Ruth's dedication to Naomi, her courage to leave her homeland, and her perseverance in the fields exemplify how faithfulness can have far-reaching consequences. Though her choices may have seemed ordinary at the time, gleaning grain, staying by Naomi's side, they became critical links in God's unfolding plan. Ruth's story illustrates that God often works through the humble and seemingly insignificant actions of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary purposes. Finally, Ruth's life is a testament to God's inclusivity and grace. As a Moabitess, she was a foreigner in Israel, a people traditionally wary of outsiders. Yet, because of her faith and loyalty, she was welcomed, honored, and ultimately became an ancestor of King David and part of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. This powerful lesson reminds us that God's blessings are not limited by heritage, nationality, or status. Faithfulness, love, and trust in God can break down barriers and allow anyone to play a pivotal role in His divine plan, regardless of their background or past. The story of Ruth culminates in a profound celebration of hope, restoration, and divine purpose. Boaz and Ruth's union was not just a personal blessing, but a fulfillment of God's plan, connecting ordinary people to extraordinary outcomes. Ruth's pregnancy, a miraculous gift after years of uncertainty, symbolized God's faithfulness and the restoration of Naomi's family. The women of Bethlehem rejoiced, not only for Ruth and Boaz, but for Naomi, recognizing that the child born would continue the lineage of her late husband. Their praises highlighted the remarkable truth: loyalty and love often bring blessings that exceed the imagination. Naomi's joy in holding her grandson Obed was more than a personal triumph, it represented the restoration of hope and legacy. Through Ruth's faithfulness and Boaz's integrity, what was once lost, family, security, and honor, was beautifully restored. Obed's birth connected the generations, bridging the past with a future of promise. The communal acknowledgement, with neighbors naming the child and celebrating his arrival, reinforced the idea that God's work often impacts not just individuals, but entire communities. Each act of kindness and faithfulness rippled outward, creating blessings that touched many lives. Ruth's story also emphasizes God's ability to work through the unlikely and marginalized. A Moabitess, once considered an outsider, became an essential link in Israel's royal lineage and ultimately the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Her inclusion demonstrates that faith and obedience to God transcend ethnicity, social status, and cultural prejudices. God's plans are not constrained by human expectations, and He often chooses the humble and faithful to accomplish extraordinary purposes. Through Ruth, we see a clear example of how God elevates the overlooked, turning apparent disadvantages into instruments of His divine plan. Finally, the story reminds us that every small act of faithfulness carries eternal significance. Ruth's decision to leave her homeland, to stay loyal to Naomi, and to work diligently in Boaz's field were seemingly simple choices that had monumental consequences. God used these acts to shape history, showing that our daily decisions, made with integrity, courage, and love, can become part of His greater design. As we reflect on Ruth's journey, we are reminded that faith, patience, and trust in God's timing can transform loss into hope, despair into joy, and ordinary lives into instruments of extraordinary destiny.